Hello. I thought I would today talk about, I kind of jump the gun just a tiny bit, but I would jump the gun in a pedagogical context to use an example of the kind of question that we're going to be looking at in the future as a learning tool for the material that we just went over, really pretty much all of the material we've gone over in the last 3 months. And of course, every question is going to kind of do that. Every question, rather, is going to reaffirm what it is we already know about the planets, about the signs, about the aspects, about the houses, right? It's always going to be that. And so every type of question in its own way is going to do that. Every question that you get when we get to the exegesis of how to actually answer the question, there's going to be all of these ways in which we're going to get our knowledge of astrology kind of reaffirmed back at us in particular, or rather within the context of that question. Not in within, yes, so within the context of that question. So what I thought I would do is I would start with this one. It's in the works of Saul and Mashallah, and I think it's a Benjamin Dyke's translation, Astrology of the Persians or something like that, and it's page 609. And of course, we will come back to it. And I'd like to propose this as another group activity because we've got another year together. We can assume that at some point within the year, you will be invited to someone's house for dinner, or you will be invited to a baby shower where it's going to be catered, or you will be invited to a potluck, or you will be invited to a wedding that has food, or you will be invited to a banquet. And so I think it will be fun that, or some religious banquet or whatever the hell, right? So I think that it would actually be fun. Well, we just passed Easter, didn't we? To make this our kind of ongoing group chart that we work with, right? You just whenever this happens throughout the year, then hopefully we can manifest this into existence. Then we will you put this chart forward to the group and say, okay, I'm going to this on the blah blah blah. What are we going to have? Because if I think you remember, one of the most important astrological kind of events of my life was hearing this guy by the name of Hart Defau talking about Prashna or horary for the first time. He was a Vedic astrologer, and this was in 1994, and him talking about his teacher and his group being invited to this banquet and the teacher doing a prashna for the banquet. And he predicted everything that they would eat at the banquet. And one of the things that he said specifically, and it was because the moon was in whatever the area that represented the desserts, he said, oh, and we will have white sweets. And they went to the dinner, and they had white sweets, for including all of the other things that he had mentioned. So what I like about this particular question is, like I already said, it becomes a pedagogical exercise, but it's not related to any specific house. So it's not I mean, it could be kind of a fifth house question if we were really thinking about it, because banquets are something that give pleasure and and it's food and drink, etc., and enjoyment, or possibly. But I thought, let's kind of go into this. I thought what I do is kind of do a little bit of an outline of it. I won't maybe go super into it, but an outline of how it's teaching us the stuff that we have been learning, and how we're getting it reinforced, how we need to reinforce it for ourselves, but also be able to be recognizing it when we're looking at this material. Oops, got ahead of myself. Okay, so if you're invited to a banquet or to some party, or you were asked about the foods of some people, look at the ascendant to see if it were movable, fixed, or cadent, right, or common. right? So that's immediately the first thing is learning about the modalities, is understanding the modalities and how differently the modalities are going to operate, right? So if the ascendant is movable, then they're going to have a lot of appetizers. If it's fixed, they're going to only have one. If it's a common, they're going to eat two, right? Because what's the other word for common? Double-bodied or dual, right? So appetizers, movable signs will give us many, right? Because we moved from one to the other. Fixed signs, obviously the crystallization, we only do one thing and we do it really well. And then common, well, I thought I would give them a choice between two things. Now they're talking about, and this is perfect. Now we're talking about the different flavors for each planet based on who the moon is in connection with, right? If the moon were in the ascendant, or rather, who's in the ascendant? Sorry about that. If the moon were in the ascendant, right? Because so then the food is going to be salted, right? Because that's her taste. Her flavor is salt. Then if Mars is there, it's bitter. If Jupiter's there, sweet. If Sun, sharpness. Or this eruca or mustard taste. Venus, light, or rather greasy. I would go with the rich and greasy, and the dense meat. And whatever belongs to that. So fatty and greasy, and it's like macaroni and cheese, and great meats and all that stuff. Mercury signifies piercing flavors, so maybe the spicy and anything mixed. Indeed, Saturn signifies a violent and distasteful taste, right? And there's also this whole thing about Saturn and how clean the food is. So we've already now we're reinforcing our knowledge of, and we're reinforcing the need to understand the planets as signifiers of certain, or significators of certain things, right? So when when we're looking at these ridiculous lists of what these things are, of what these planets represent, and because it's not in language that is either that represents a narrative of any kind, or that we can personally identify with through behavior, then we're like, why do I need to know that the moon is bitter in flavor? But now we know that if we're going to this banquet, we can actually tell what the flavors of the food will be if there's a planet in the first house, right? So this is kind of the reason that we're doing the thing that we do. After this, look at the separation of the moon and her conjunction. And so, of course, this is going to be something we're going to see all the time. And we're not going to get into what conjunction and separation mean just yet, because that's actually coming next month. But most of you know that that aspects both apply and separate. And so that's all I'm going to say until we get to it. You all should more than likely know the difference between an applying aspect and a separating aspect. And if not, we're going to go into that next month when we get into our class on the 16 ways. So if she were separated from so basically it's talking about what happens if she's leaving this something that's negative and going to something that's positive, right? She's separating from a malefic planet, and she's applying to a benefic. And from a square in opposition, it says that she'll not be able to come about, but the master will give a reason. So basically, I guess it's saying that the reasons come through the separation. If it's separating from something negative and joining to something positive, then you're going to get some kind of reason, and it's more than likely going to be for a good reason, like a wedding banquet, a circumcision, only good for the people eating, right? Not for the baby, unfortunately, and anything else like that, baby shower, etc. If it's a trine or sextile, it's a conference or retaliation. So just interesting. Once again, you get it gives you rather a narrative for every operation in the chart, right? So a narrative for every operation, right? So now the first operation was planets in the ascendant, right, which gave us our flavors. Now the next operation is looking at whatever aspects the moon is involved in, because that gives us our reason. Now the next thing is, if however the planet to whom the moon is being joined were in an angle, right? It didn't matter prior to this, the banquet will be one day. Now it's saying, now it's giving us this idea that we've talked about a lot about advancement. We're going to get into all of this next month rather. If a planet is angular, if a planet is succedent, if a planet is cadent, right? How the difference between how planets operate when they're in those particular angles. We've called it a state of advancement if a planet is in an angle. We've called it a state of an angle or a succedent. We've called it a state of retreat, right? So now we're going into that. We're creating a narrative around that. So if the moon's joined to a planet in an angle, the banquet's going to be one day. And if it were a common sign, it would be more than one day. Right. So all of a sudden it gives us another idea of how long this banquet will be. And now we get into the Lord of the domicile of the moon. So if the moon aspects her own planet, right, then they talk about the disturbance for someone who will throw them into disarray at the banquet. So that's basically, remember, any planet that rules another planet gives it a reason for how it does thing, or governs how it's going to go about. And the moon is the co-significator of the question. So she becomes the co-significator of the banquet. So the ruler of the moon becomes kind of a secret influence. And so this is kind of how it's showing itself, not a secret influence, but a rude influence. So the banquet will be disturbed, for someone who will throw them into disarray will be at the banquet. Then they will make peace, and afterwards they will return to the banquet. I think that's very interesting. But because think about the moon as changeability, right? The moon as things going up and down, or the unexpected mood swings. Think of the moon as mood swings. So now we've got this Lord of the domicile of the moon. So basically the planet who rules the sign that the moon is in, being involved with the moon. Then there's all of a sudden a disturbance. That's so fascinating. I'd be interesting to see if that's something that shows up. But a disturbance in the waters, shall we say? You would think it'd be just the opposite on some level. If the moon were joined to Jupiter, right? So if now they're talking about which planet, the nobility of the banquet represents the nobility of the banquet and the multitude of the appetizers, right? Right, multitude in Jupiter, right? Makes perfect sense. If she were joined to sun, signifies cleanliness. The sun represents cleanliness, right? There's no disinfectant like sunlight, or the beauty of the appetizers, or the multitude of sharp foods, right? So once again, we get flavors, we get the significations of the planet we're talking about, which is why we need to know that the sun rules cleanliness. And also the sun, something shiny and new is beautiful, right? Remember, we've talked about the Supremes and all of the Leo. All three women have stuff in Leo, and there was all these shiny dresses, right? And this beauty and glamour and shiny, so that's exactly where the sun would be. And if she were joined to Venus, it signifies the beauty of the foods, right? Right. Once again, beauty, because that's Venus's domain. So once again, I'm just saying, every time that we're going to get into any of these questions, we're going to get reinforced what we should know about all of these things, right? So we know when we get to Venus, we're in the region of beauty and pleasure. Right, we're dealing with the sun. We're in the region of display and cleanliness and honor and prestige. Right, when it's Jupiter, we know we're in the presence of bishops or priests or bishops or wisdom. Right, so this is the way to be kind of looking at things. And if she were joined to Venus, it signifies the beauty of the foods of the feeds, and the multitude of their sweetness, with games and listening and laughter and the sweetness of odor. Right? All of those things make sense, right? Because all of those things, she's mirth and enjoyment and pleasure. She's beauty and pleasure. Right? So, and if she's joined to Mercury, what is he? He's what? He's going to be gestures. He's going to be books and writings and speeches, right? He's the tongue. Let's see. So it signifies the performances of men in that same place, and that there will be someone who speaks wisdom, right, and tells it, and the appetizers will be multiplied, and the narrations of stories or fables, and they will use the meats of birds in the foods. And of course, Mercury, both of his signs have wings, right? So here's the thing. So if we're going to come into this material, I'm going to do my very best to kind of break it down for us. I know that this material is not very engaging. It's a slog to get through, and it seems like there's very little reward. It has to be read and reread. It takes time to get into. It takes time to understand. The most important thing I can say is the more you know, the more you really focus on knowing what all of the planets represent, what the signs represent. And of course, I'm not talking, and especially I'm not talking about from the modern psychological standpoint, right? The less the kind of the less the more that we can break away from that standpoint, the better that the learning is going to be, because the more that you know that, oh, Mercury, we're going to be looking at performances of men in some place and people who speak and narrations, right? That should be absolutely obvious, right? Because Mercury, it rules the tongue. Mercury rules speech and knowledge and intelligence, right? So we would expect discourse, we would expect knowledge, we would expect narrations of stories, a storyteller, a jester. I thought maybe a jester, but a jester might be more of a Venus Mercury thing, right? So get it? So it's just going to keep being reinforced. And it's the conjunction where it's Saturn, uncleanliness. There we go. I just put that thing in today into our hashtag SSS, Saturn and dirt, right? Uncleanliness of the food, and that the appetizers are fishes. Now we'll see this a lot with in this particular version of Saul, using Saturn for fish. And I think it's because of two things. One, Saturn represents boats, and two, Saturn represented the diversion of waters, like dams and aquifers and things of that nature. Okay. And that the appetizers of fishes and whatever enters the water will be multiplied in that place. Indeed, were the conjunction with Mars. Now, what would we expect? Can we in contention and arguments, right? And then sharp and bitter foods, hot, heat, quarrels will fall between them, and then they will eat every hot thing, right? And if he were in the midheaven, it signifies that quarrels will fall between them. And so, and then in the next paragraph, he goes so far as to say, hey, and don't even go if the moon is with Mars, right? Makes sense. If the moon is with Mars in the same sign, right? If it's conjuncting Mars, that's what we think of as a conjunction now, right? Don't go. And if it's right, or she were joined to him from one of the angles, right? Don't go. You'll regret it, right? Because you will chastise yourself at its end. Likewise, if she were with Saturn, right? Those are the two malefics, because it signifies the uncleanliness of the foods and their vileness. Now, you could see those not go and still call them up and say, oh, hey, what did you have? Right? And see if we were right, right? Because he's just told us what it would be, what we would more than likely be served. But he's also telling us if the moon is applying or involved with Mars or Saturn, and especially from an angle, don't go. Right? Because one, it's either going to be a Mars type event, or it's going to be a Saturn type event. Right? It's going to be, so Mars type event is obviously people get into fights. Saturn type event is, ew, that was horrible. Oh, I wish I'd never gone. What a bore. Or God, the food was terrible. Could you taste anything? Like, was there any? Did they even use anything? Did they even use salt? I mean, like like a macrobiotic meal or something like that. But that's maybe not so bad, not so bad as macrobiotic. But if you did go, you would find sweetness in those foods which are there. Oh, no, that's interesting. Likewise, if she were with Saturn, because it signifies the uncleanliness of the foods and their vileness. And if you did go, you would not find sweetness. I thought it said you would find sweetness. You would not find sweetness in those foods which are there. Absolutely. Indeed, if the moon were with Venus or Mercury, go, because you will see what pleases you. Likewise, if it were Jupiter, there will be multiplied in that same banquet rice that is a certain kind of grain, etc. Right? Now they go into if it's with the Lord of the Hour, and that's something that we're not going to really kind of talk about. But what they do use is this idea of if the Lord of the Hour is in the ascendant or the midheaven, it basically talks about the beginning of the beginning or the end of the beginning. So, and when the food will show up. So does the food show up at the very beginning, but you don't get to eat until everybody gets there? Because that's kind of what they're, or you eat at the very beginning. So they're saying if the Lord of the Hour is in the ascendant or the midheaven, the food will be brought right in, or like you walk in and the food is already there. And if it were removed from these two places, they will eat before it is served. Now, that doesn't make any sense. And it will not be served until this star is removed from the ascendant from the midheaven. I'm not going to go into that for a second, so just forget that I read it. I'm sorry. And if it were in the seventh, because you're going to be like, what does that mean? If you want me to go into it privately, I'm happy to do that. And you've got the book, so you can also read the subtext or the sub, what is it? I forget this, but you know what it is. I mean, number 5, read number 511. What is it? What is that called? It's been such a long time. Footnote, read the footnote. And if it were in the 7th or in the 4th, the food will not be served until until the place is filled up. See, so it talks about the beginning, when the food gets there. Is it there at the beginning of the beginning, right? Because when you eat is not necessarily always when the food comes out. And we've also, oh my God, right? We've gone to things where you get there, the food is out, you can't what you think you're gonna eat, and then there are all of these speeches and other things that have to happen before you can, or it hasn't been served yet, or you're not served yet. You sit down, there's a program that takes place, and then the food comes out, right? And so think of the many types of ways a banquet can happen. Of course, if it's a small, but even in a small dinner party, you get there, you're starving, and they're like, oh, we thought we'd play a little bit of Pictionary before we ate, right? Oh, we're not quite ready yet. And you're like, oh, fuck, I should have eaten those potato chips, right? But I was trying not to spoil it, right? So that's kind of what that's getting into. And if you were asked by a client if they were that was invited and the moon were in a watery sign, now it's getting into the different types of things that would happen based kind of on where the moon is, etc. That I don't want to get into too much. I want to get into the thing that's after that. You, of course, are welcome to. But you, of course, are welcome to, but that's a little bit further in than I want to go into, because there's another section that I like better, that I think is more useful to our reason for looking at things at the moment. Okay, know that the ascendant signifies the reason for the banquet. And if it were domicile of Venus, it would be nuptials, right? So now, and so here's the thing. You should be able to tell me so if it's the domicile of Venus, then it's what? If it's the domicile of Mercury, what is it, on account of a graduation, maybe? A child? Oh, right. Mercury is young people, child or children. So there's our whole thing with baby showers, etc. Right? I would thought maybe Jupiter, but not necessarily, right? That could be a what's the word when my uncle got? An ordination, right, for Jupiter, or it could also be that could be maybe graduation, right? Because remember, the 9th house really had more to do with the education than the 3rd, or anything, or Jupiter had to do with knowledge, has to do definitely very much with knowledge. Mercury, intelligence, Jupiter with knowledge. So indeed, if it were in the domicile of Jupiter, a friend. Oh, Jupiter as the who rejoices in the 11th. Jupiter, a friend, is preparing the party. I was wondering what it was, and there it was right in front of me. I mean, I've been doing that on purpose, kind of, but then at the same time, I didn't even read ahead. I just stopped because of the children thing. But right, Mercury rules young people, young children, right? Mercury rules children. Venus rules nuptials and marriages, right? Jupiter rules rules people who benefit you, right? People like a friend who benefit you, or people in whom you can have trust, right? Because remember, faith and trust and hope are all aspects of the 11th house. The thing in which you put your trust is an 11th house matter, like a friend. And the second sign from the ascendant signify, oh, now this is so interesting. now we go into the houses and their significations. So this kind of gives us an example, and you're going to see this with many of these um, questions. So we know already that the head is ruled by the first house, so the head will have all of the intentions, right? So that thus we know that the ascendant is the intention for the actual banquet itself. Then we also know that the second sign, so now we know that the second represents the vessels in which they drink. Why does that make sense? Because the second is the house of substance. So it's the stuff you use, the stuff you use, that you own, that you use, that you use. So the vessel in which they drink and the furnishings of the house, right? The stuff that the furniture, everything that's owned by the place. If the second sign were common, now we start to break it down even further. Common signs, we're going to have colored vessels. If Mars were in the same sign, it's copper. Copper is reddish. And if it were with Venus and then silver, all of a sudden, so we start to see all these different ways in which we would bring in Jupiter, silver and gold, and Moon glass, and Saturn wood and earthenware. Note that Saturn is the lowest class ship. Right? And if benefics were in the second sign, it signifies the beauty of the house's decoration. Right? Makes sense? Right? Makes sense. It all makes so much sense. But we have to be thinking this way, and we have to know our shit. That's the most important thing. I mean, it teaches us, but we have to have it there too. It can't be like a surprise, All right, so, and if the benefics were in the second, we've just said that. If, however, the benefic were peregrine, right, we've talked about that. Now we're talking about essential dignity of the planet there. It will belong to someone else, right? So when we rent out our furnishings for our parties or whatever, that's an example. And if it had testimony in it, it will be of the household. The decoration will be of the household. So when he says that a testimony in it, I think he's saying it would, if it were aspecting the ruler of the second house, then he says it would belong to the house. That's as far, or the moon is that, but I think more like testimony. Oh, maybe testimony could also be that he's got, face or term, or he's got the lesser dignities but doesn't have, so it could be maybe in either of those ways. But testimony usually involves, usually when I think about testimony, it usually involves rulership, or it involves the aspect. Third sign signifies, okay, so the third sign signifies those who are present, right? People at hand. So like your siblings and neighbors, right? Remember that the third house is your neighbors. So the third house in this particular instance is people at hand, people around me. Indeed, the fourth from the ascendant, the place itself, right? Because the fourth house is things above and under the ground. Which, if it were a common sign, now we're splitting it into common, fixed, and immutable. I mean, common, fixed, and movable. If it were a common sign, their banquet will be on a porch. If Sun or Jupiter were in it, the banquet will be in a closed part of the house or in the south. Isn't that interesting? So I don't know why in that particular case, but common signs, you got, if common signs with what are the fourth house, it's going to be outside, like a nice outside porch type dinner. Sounds lovely. And if the fifth sign were from the ascendant, signifies their beverages, right? Because the fifth house is the house of pleasure and amusements, and it involves things like taverns. For a common sign, diverse beverages. Jupiter in it. So then it talks about what kinds of drinks you would have based on the planets. Sixth from the ascendant signifies the servers. Now we get kind of to this behind stairs part. Sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth. Sixth, seventh, and eighth all represent the back stairs of the people serving and cooking. So, and I don't actually get this fully yet. Now, the seventh kind of makes sense because that's kind of your personal attendant. So, and also it could be the person who's heading everything for the behind stairs. I'm interested in why the butler is the. I'm interested in all of this. Why the butler is the seventh. Why the eighth belongs to the cooks and bakers. Although, of course, we don't see the kitchen usually, right? Where the kitchen is a foreign place where the magic happens, right? It's totally. I think that makes the most sense. Is that it's eighth house and it's basically like this underworld that no one knows of, but it produces all of these things. And then the ninth, those who serve its dishes, right? So all of that is backstairs. So I think that's a really interesting thing. Like I said, once again, I don't understand why, but 6 to 9, that whole thing is about who's serving you in specifics. And note that the 6th and the 9th both are talking about. So I mean, think, that makes sense that there would be a lot of people serving more than likely in this time period. For banquet, we're not talking about a family dinner, but we're talking about a banquet. Also, the 10th sign signifies the goodness of foods, whether he would rejoice without those invited or not. Because if the benefics were in the midheaven, he will rejoice with them, and if the malefics were in it, they will be hateful to him or his friends. So basically, the things in the midheaven tell you exactly kind of how it's going to go. So the first house tells you what the intention, but the midheaven tells you how it's going to go for you specifically. How you will experience the public event. And the 11th, brothers and friends, and the 12th, the master of the household, whether he desires this or not. And so, of course, that's the person behind the scenes who owns the actual place you're using. And so I find that really interesting. And so they go into other news. And so actually, let's just look at this for 1 second, because this does, once again, reinforce what it is we have been learning. Look at the place of the benefics and the malefics in these malefics in these 12 places. Were a benefic in any sign, and its lord made fortunate. Judge good, right? So it's always the same stuff. Is this thing going to be in good? Is it made fortunate? We just looked at what makes planets fortunate and what makes planets impeded, right? Judge good and judge for him who pertains to that domicile. And in whichever one there was a malefic or its lord were impeded, everything which pertains to that domicile and all of its matters will be destroyed. This is really important. So I'm going to read it again. Look at the places of the benefics and the malefics in those 12 and in these 12 places. Let's just use as an example the kitchen, the bakers and cooks. Okay. If there's a benefic in the 8th, right, I'd feel kind of good about that on some level, right? Because then that says that the cooks and the bakers should be producing well, right? Were a benefic in any sign and its lord made fortunate. So not just the benefic has to be in the house, but its lord also has to be in good condition. Judge good and joy for him who pertains to that domicile, right? Okay, so actually that might be the working conditions of the bakers, that it's going really, really well for them, right? It's really enjoyable. They love working. It's peaceful. Everybody's doing well, right? Judge good for them. Judge for him who pertains to that domicile. And whichever one there were a malefic or its lord were impeded, everything which pertains to that domicile and all of its matters will be destroyed. Let's say that there's a malefic in the 8th house of the bakers and cooks, and its lord is impeded. Now that could affect the working situation to such an extent that maybe the food is affected. So once again, we get reinforced why we needed to learn the shit the way we needed to learn it. right? So that is our first exegesis. You can see it can be kind of hard going. It can be kind of hard going, this material, and I get that. And it's like I said, it's a slog. It's an excavation. We can't just fly through it, unfortunately. But what helps us to be able to fly through it is to understand the fact that it's always reiterating the process and the substance of our knowledge, right? The substance of our knowledge and the processes that we have learned. It's always going to say, if it's cadent, it's this. If it's angular, it's this. If it's succeeding, it's this. It's going to say, if it's Venus, it's beauty. If it's the sun, it's this. Right? It's always going to reinforce it. So this is the reason to just be. Maybe one of the next videos will be about kind of ways for creating study of significations in this way. One of the best ways, obviously, is to put the planet on one side of a card and put a bunch of the significations on another. And then also, kind of like we're doing with the triple S hashtag, is as you're out in the world, as you're in the kitchen, look at your stuff around you and point at it and tell which planet rules it. And be thinking, when you pass something really lovely, there's Venus. When you pass a beggar, that stinks and is dirty, there's Saturn. Right? When you pass a little kid going to school with his backpack, there's Mercury. When you pass a priest, there's Jupiter. Right? These are all expressions of the planets, and they're around you all the time. Okay, that's where I'm going to stop.